and welcome to Source Intelligence's Modern Day Slavery, the Harsh Reality of Global Supply Chains webinar. My name is Jay Sailing, and I will be the moderator for today's broadcast. We have some fantastic experts with us, so you can learn more about key insights into developing forms of modern-day slavery and best practices around developing a strong ethical sourcing program. Before we get started, we have some general housekeeping to go over. All PowerPoint slides and a recording of this webinar will be emailed once available. It will also be made available on our website, sourceintelligence.com/webinar library. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the GoToWebinar control panel. Answers will be sent in a follow-up document in the coming days. You can also email questions directly to education@sourceintelligence.com. Now it's time for some brief introductions. As I mentioned, my name is Jay Sailing from Source Intelligence, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I work in the Business Development Department here at Source Intelligence, and I run the thought leadership for the European Union and the Ethical Sourcing Solution. We will first hear from Killian Moot, an expert on supply chain transparency and legal disclosure. Killian joined Humanity United in 2015 as the NovaChain project director. Prior to joining Humanity United, he conceptualized and led Free to Work, a risk assessment and evaluation tool funded by the U.S. State Department, which focused on promoting transparency in supply chains. Source Intelligence's own Robert Kirk will then take the stage. Robert is a business development manager here at Source Intelligence, and as a long-time member of the SI family, Robert has helped many of the world's largest brands develop strong compliance programs specializing in the ethical sourcing area. Here's a brief look at today's agenda. We are very excited to have Killian speak, and he will start by breaking down NovaChain's new sector-specific benchmark report. He will be outlining the information, communication, and technology sector. He will then discuss developing forms of modern-day slavery as supply chains become increasingly complex. Robert Kirk will then speak on the challenges behind a strong ethical sourcing program. He will talk about the importance of strong data and the power of platform technology having the ability to overcome supply chain compliance programs. As a reminder, you may ask any questions you'd like during the webinar. Simply post them in the chat box on the bottom section of the GoTo meeting, and we will address them in the follow-up document. All right, without further ado, I'm going to let Killian begin. Killian, take it away.
Thanks, Jay, for that introduction. And as Jay mentioned, I'm the project director for NovaChain. We are a project focused on engaging companies and investors on the issue of forced labor in supply chains. We do this through creating trend reporting as well as a few benchmarks, one of which I will walk you through today, where we look at a numerous array of issues that relate to forced labor in the supply chains for high-tech companies. According to the International Labor Organization, there's an estimated 21 million people who are victims of forced labor today. Forced labor in the private economy generates 150 billion in global profits a year. While forced labor is largely outlawed in every country around the world, it works its way into multiple company supply chains through opacity in production, where companies might not have significant visibility all the way down the supply chain or within every specific stage of production. There are a variety of different sectors that are at high risk to the issue of forced labor. A few of these are highlighted here, and they range in types of production as well as regions of production as well as types of supply chains. Some of those that are more prevalent include construction for things such as bricks and other materials. We also see this in agriculture, in palm oil, as well as in timber and cotton. Apparel and footwear is also an industry as a whole that sees significant risk to the issue, food and beverage as well. And the one today that we're going to talk a little bit about is the electronic sector, where it has potential risks at both the mineral and extractive level as well as at the manufacturing and final stage of production. The issue of forced labor is one that has been in the general element of awareness for a while. And in the recent few years, we've seen a change in how companies understand these issues. A survey by The Economist last year found that 3 out of 4 executives of the nearly 600 executives polled felt that they had a responsibility to respect human rights and go beyond obedience with local laws. So we're seeing kind of this understanding in this change at the executive C-suite level where this issue of forced labor, this issue of human rights, is something that a company needs to pay attention to. We're also seeing this in terms of companies not only being aware, but acknowledging that there is a likelihood that slavery might exist in their supply chain. A survey by Ethical Trading Initiative, a multi-stakeholder initiative out of the UK, found that 71% of those surveyed believe that slavery might be in their supply chain. I'd like to take time now to dive a little bit deeper into the risks that exist for companies in the information and communications technology sector, or high tech as it's commonly known. There's 2 examples where forced labor is prevalent, among other ways, in the high tech supply chain. One is with conflict minerals, and what these are specifically minerals that might work their way into a company's supply chain that are associated with perpetuating conflict in a specific region or country. This is not specifically and solely forced labor, but forced labor is a significant element of when conflict minerals are a part of a company's supply chain. And what we've seen is mandatory due diligence, whether that's through the United States government's Dodd-Frank, which requires disclosure through the SEC, or some other mandated due diligence that we're seeing in the European Union as well. The other way, or one other way, in which forced labor can manifest itself in the electronic sector is at the final stage of production, at the manufacturing level. A report came out in 2014 by the researcher from Verite, who was also a partner on NovaChain, and they found that nearly 1 in 4 workers were in a situation of forced labor in the electronic sector in Malaysia, and that rate increased to 1 in 3 workers for foreign workers who had been recruited. What we've done at NovaChain is we've recently released a report where we evaluated the 20 top marked companies in the ICT sector and evaluated them on their ability to address forced labor in their supply chain. We did this through a methodology that included 7 specific themes: commitment and governance. So this looked at a company's overall policies, largely in their awareness about the issue, as well as stakeholder engagement. Their traceability and risk assessment, where we're looking at the degree to which they are engaging down their supply chain and the degree to which they are publicly disclosing information about how they manage their supply chain. Their purchasing practices, and this range from a company's awareness about how purchasing practices might inadvertently drive risk and how they're fully acknowledging, or the degree to which they're acknowledging that those issues might contribute in some way to the risk of forced labor. The recruitment practices, so what recruitment elements occur in terms of workers being recruited into the situation of employment. The 5th theme that we looked at was worker voice, and this looked at ways in which a company is engaging workers outside of the traditional monitoring process, as well as ways in which they're engaging the community to ensure workers are protected. And the final 2 are monitoring and remedy, where we looked at the degree to which a company is monitoring their policies and any remedial steps they're taking to address known abuses. Of the benchmark companies, you will see that we evaluate 20, and this evaluation ran the spectrum of companies at the high end of 72 and the low end of 0. For full details of how every individual company was evaluated, you can find more information on our website, knowthechain.org. In the evaluation process, companies were also provided the opportunity to disclose more information in their research window through the engagement process. So in the engagement of the individual companies, they could provide additional and disclose additional information if that information was not publicly available. Overall, companies scored 39 out of 100, with the scores breaking down in different ways. We saw higher scores in commitment and governance, where largely this was focused on the high-level policies or commitments, down to the low end, where worker voice, we saw the average score of 16 for companies on this specific theme. Companies disclosed more information, and so we saw a little bit higher of a score there on average at 46, as well as at monitoring the degree to which they're auditing or evaluating their supply chain. They scored an average of 47. One area that I want to take the time to dig a little bit deeper into is specifically on the recruitment aspect of our evaluation of the ICT sector. On our website, NovaChain.org, the full scope of this information can be found. You can look at an individual company as well as an aggregate finding for the theme and indicator level to give you a better sense of what steps companies and the industry are taking to address the issue of forced labor in their supply chains. One example of where workers might be at a heightened degree of risk is in the recruitment process. This was seen again in the Malaysia report that Verite did in 2014, where they found that 1 in 3 foreign workers whom largely had been recruited was in a situation of forced labor. These workers are at higher risk because they frequently take out loans to pay brokers fees in order to acquire work. And in a situation where a migrant worker is paying to acquire a job, they then potentially fall victim to debt bondage, a way in which the broker binds them to a specific employment contract. In terms of overall risk, something to be aware of if you are a company is that in a globalized economy today, we have over 150 million migrant workers worldwide. The ILO estimates that this is nearly 70% of all migrants worldwide are actually migrant workers who are actually relocating specifically to find work or for work. 26.7 million of those workers are in the construction industry, and 16.7 work in agriculture. This type of work is broadly defined as dirty, dangerous, and difficult. Is a term used frequently by the ILO, the International Labor Organization, and it's estimated that between 3 to 5 million migrant workers are operating specifically in Malaysia in this type of production, whether it's dirty, dangerous, or difficult. That estimate of 3 to 5 includes both legal and illegal migrants who find themselves working in Malaysia, some of which are working specifically within the electronic sector. Within the recruitment area of our benchmark, we looked at really 3 different indicators, the first of which looked at the company's approach. Within this element, there were 4 different specific points that we evaluated, and the details of which can be found on our website. But largely what we're looking at is the degree to which the company demonstrates awareness of the risks of exploitation of migrant workers by recruitment agencies and brokers, and what degree they have relevant policies to address it. Some companies would endeavor to actually ensure that suppliers hire directly, and we will discuss that further. On average, the score is about 13, but we had disclosure on the high end of 75 and on the low end of 0 for this specific indicator. The next element that we looked at was for recruitment fees. This is specifically looking at the degree to which companies in our benchmark had policies and standards that require that no fees be charged during the recruitment process. Again, recruitment fees, if used, can actually increase the risk of a worker if they are forced to pay or if they have to pay to acquire specific work. That fee might be used in some way to entrap them or force them to work. On average, we saw a little bit higher, 36, and this ranged from companies scoring 0 all the way up to companies scoring 100 on this specific indicator. And there are 2 different elements that we evaluated when scoring companies on this indicator. The final indicator that we looked at was recruitment audits, the degree to which the company actually is auditing their specific recruiters or those recruiters that are being used in their supply chain. This ranged from 0 to 50. No company scored a full 100 on this one. and the average score was 8. So very few practices that we were able to identify that related to specifically auditing of recruitment. The other intention of our report was not only to give a sense of where the industry stands on the issue of forced labor in supply chains, but we also wanted to identify some notable findings. For our benchmark report that you can download, we identified notable findings for every individual theme within the benchmark. But a few that we want to highlight here as it relates to recruitment practices, one are of HP. They have a specific policy that requires that suppliers seek possible to minimize the use of recruitment agents and hire foreign migrant workers directly. So to ensure that there is some kind of accountability and that migrant workers have appropriate employment situation when they're working within a supplier's factory. The other companies that we want to highlight here are Apple and Cisco, which disclose information as it relates to recruitment fees. They demonstrated evidence that they ensure that suppliers reimburse recruitment fees if they are charged, which is in violation of their specific policies. Since 2008, Apple has reimbursed or ensured the reimbursement of nearly $26 million in recruitment fees were paid back to workers in their supply chain. If you are a high-tech company or a company in general that largely has some degree of exposure to recruitment practices in your supply chain, workers that are recruited into your supply chain, there are a few areas that we recommend companies pay attention to. The first is recruitment fees. Ensure that no fee are charged in the supply chain to workers. This again ensures that workers aren't vulnerable to exploitation. And this policy could potentially include a process by which you ensure that any fees that are charged are repaid to the worker. Another area that we encourage companies to consider is a policy to ensure that workers are hired directly. This then ensures that an individual worker, if they are recruited, is in a situation of direct employment rather than working indirectly for a recruitment agency. The final area that we encourage companies to consider is audit of the recruitment agencies. Auditing and monitoring is understood to be a best practice in other areas of work, and we encourage companies to consider the adoption of recruitment auditing practices as well to ensure that any workers who are being recruited are done so using ethical and responsible recruitment practices. Finally, this full benchmark report and our findings, which was released on June 22nd, can be found on our website, knowthechain.org. There's also a resource section for companies that are beginning down the path of understanding how to address the issue of forced labor in their supply chains, whether you be an ICT company or a company in another sector. Our resource section is intended to be helpful for you, or a helpful guide to begin that process. Our reports as well can be helpful to identify what leading practices are and what some of our recommendations would be for companies that we're evaluating. We released this benchmark. It's our first this year. We will be doing a benchmark for food and beverage companies, which will be released in the fall of 2016, and footwear and apparel, which will be released in the winter of 2016 as well. If you have any information or would like to contact me, you can reach me at kmoot@humanityunited.org. For more information, please visit our website, knowthechain.org. And with that, I will hand it back over to Jay. Thank you so much.
Killian, thank you very much for that comprehensive breakdown. Great stuff. We have quite a few questions coming in right now, and I'd just like to remind everybody that all questions will be addressed in the follow-up document set to be sent out in the coming days. Okay, next we have Robert Kirk. Robert, you have the floor.
Thanks for the introduction, Jay, and I'm really excited to be here on behalf of Source Intelligence talking about such a spotlight topic. The economics of globalization have brought many positive developments that people all over the world get to enjoy. Jobs are being created in developing countries, people are getting access to resources no matter their positioning on the globe, travel's much more accommodating, and people are more interconnected than ever. However, globalization has brought a complexity to supply chains. that unfortunately has increased the chance of forced labor and other forms of modern-day slavery going undetected somewhere in the supply chains of global enterprises. The increasing complexity of globalized supply chains has led companies to turn to tools and platforms that can be utilized as centralized data houses for their suppliers' information. Through utilizing these tools, companies are able to take a proactive approach at mitigating the risk of slavery happening somewhere in the supply chain. There are many unforeseen inefficiencies companies must take into account when addressing modern-day slavery in their respective supply chains. The old processes of tracking suppliers' progress and information on spreadsheets is outdated, and companies can actually be doing themselves a disservice by continuing with this burdenous process. The challenge for growing and large companies is putting a process in place that is scalable and can adapt to the ever-increasingly complex landscape of supply chain transparency. Advances in technology gives companies the ability to have a bird's-eye view of their supply chain like never before. Platform technology allows these companies to onboard all their suppliers, gather key information from each of the suppliers, and get powerful results in real time. A centralized platform can also yield valuable insights into the efficiency of your supply chain. By consolidating supplier data, companies can assess their current operations and even find ways to optimize their supply chains with the notion of putting compliance and transparency first. So the challenge to receiving strong supplier response relies heavily on supplier engagement. Technology can provide robust tools that allow you to be organized and proactive about a supplier engagement. The ability of strong, trusted data allows you to identify potential risk in your supply chain, categorize and tag suppliers with potential risk associations, and receive up-to-date results of supplier engagement. Here, we have a snapshot of a code of conduct campaign. You'll see displaying the challenges behind comprehensive engagement processes. You'll see supplier engagement fluctuations over time. Analytics that are run off this simple chart can even tell you some red flags on issues like non-responsive suppliers. The initial boom in response rates indicate the proactive suppliers that maintain strong communication. Once the initial boom is completed, the unresponsive gray area suppliers start to show their true colors. Actions do speak louder than words. Engaging with unresponsive suppliers is one of the toughest functions to overcome as an enterprise. Utilizing a platform service with a 24/7, 365-day supplier engagement team is a strong way to overcome this challenge. At Source Intelligence, we've had years of experience in learning best practices behind supplier engagement. This lower visual shows a company's supplier engagement snapshot. This graph allows you to compare your suppliers to each other and benchmark them against an average or your best supplier. The snapshot allows you to measure suppliers on various categories like requirement responses, engagement scores, due diligence practices, and the scope of each supplier relative to the rest of your supply chain based on the tagging of them. Technology allows you to run analytics on these and other metrics that help you stay in control of your supply chain. Modern-day slavery laws and regulations are developing all over the world. To ensure that you're on top of the existing and recently amended regulations, I'm going to discuss some of the newest globalized regulations to mitigate the risk of slavery in supply chains. So Senate Bill 657, otherwise known as the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, it's the first regulation at a major level which requires companies to disclose their efforts to mitigate risk in companies' supply chains. SB 657 has become somewhat of a benchmark for all forced labor regulations. So the real meat and potatoes of SB 657 is that retailers and manufacturers with more than $100 million in global revenue who sell products in California are in scope. The requirement is that, they must publicly disclose efforts to mitigate slavery on the company's main website. And the 5 main areas that are focused are verification, audits, certification, internal accountability, and training. So the UK ModernDay Slavery Act is a relatively new regulation. It came into effect in 2015, and companies must disclose on their main website their efforts to mitigate slavery in the supply chain. It came into effect October 2015. Companies that do business in the UK with greater than £36 million in annual turnover rates are in scope. The requirement, again, publicly disclose efforts to mitigate slavery on the company's main website, and the main disclosure, efforts in the past fiscal year to mitigate slavery in the company's supply chain. And then the U.S. Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. There's been a lot of buzz over at Source Intelligence on this because, companies are actually getting their goods held at customs. And a little detail on that. Basically, the U.S. Trade and Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act essentially closed a loophole of the Tariff Acts of the 1930s. The act says that all importers into the U.S. must declare that their goods were not mined, produced, or manufactured with the use of forced labor. This law was overlooked in the past due to the fact that domestic production of products could not meet domestic demand of goods in the U.S. U.S. importers started to see the ramifications of this law go into effect in April 2016 when products were held at customs from the Thailand fishery. It was pretty big in the news just a few months ago. So, as you can see, efforts to mitigate slavery in the supply chain are evolving, and more regions of the world are joining this global movement. Mitigating slavery is a daunting task, but companies can put processes in place that ensure a proactive approach to supply chain transparency. Source Intelligence provides a platform that allows companies to centralize data, run analytics, and make informed decisions about their supply chain's behavior and make positive steps towards supply chain compliance. We have a wealth of knowledge on our website that people can learn more about modern-day slavery and the advantages of platform technology. We have several white papers, webinars, infographics, and more to keep the industry up to date on all things going on in supply chain transparency. It's important for companies to understand how modern-day slavery can slip under the radar of many large firms simply because it's very deep in supply chains. For your brand's protection, it's important to make sure you have a comprehensive compliance program that covers every slide of ethical sourcing and supply chain transparency. Well, Jay, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak on this spotlight topic. And make sure that you all check out our blog for up-to-date information on modern-day slavery and supply chain transparency. Jay, I'll give the floor back to you.
Robert, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today's session. We had quite a few questions come through the chat. As I mentioned, we will have the panelists address each question offline and come up with a separate document. Once the responses are complete, we'll send out the document to all the attendees of this webinar. I'd like to take a moment to thank both Killian and Robert for sharing with our audience today. The information we took away from this webinar will certainly help companies develop programs that aim to mitigate slavery in their supply chains. This is a very challenging topic for businesses to overcome. However, with advances in technology and sector-specific approaches, I believe that we'll be able to tackle the issue. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them to education@sourceintelligence.com. We have many resources available on our website in our webinar library. Or if you would prefer to read something instead, please check out our white paper library. Educating your supply chain is an essential part of a successful program. So definitely check out our blog, which is constantly updated with current events and best practices behind supply chain communication. Well, that is all, folks. This is Jay Sailing with Source Intelligence. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.